I would like now to introduce today's presenters. David Ricard, Vice President, leads Everest Group Sourcing and Vendor Management and Customer Experience Management Services offerings for EMEA clients, as well as select global accounts. Anushi Malhotra is a Practice Director in Everest Group Sourcing and Vendor Management Practice. In this role, she advises clients on maximizing value through their supply-based engagements to obtain cost, business, and operational benefits. Kriti Gupta is a Practice Director in Everest Group's technology practice covering banking and financial services. She assists clients on topics related to account strategy, mergers and acquisition, and go-to-market strategy, and more. And with that, I would like to turn things over to David.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar today. There's a couple of areas that we wanted to cover when we're talking today, sharing some perspectives that we've picked up from our extensive work with both service providers and enterprise sourcing procurement leaders. The first area we'll be covering is around understanding portfolio strategies in outsourcing. So what are others doing, or how are people looking at their outsourcing portfolios? And then secondly, we'll be sharing some market perspectives in terms of what we're seeing in the market, which maybe help educate your own thinking. And then time permitting, we'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. So please submit them through the ability through the chat, the Q&A tab if you can. Also we'll take them at the end as well. So before we get going into the content, I'd really like just to ask a question of the audience, just so we can get a sense of how your challenges compare. So we're going to launch a poll in a minute, which is really to look at which of the following factors have triggered a re-evaluation or changes to your outsourcing portfolio or to your portfolio strategy. So is it the rising cost of labor and materials? Is it the shortage of talent and skills? Is it the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Is it the service providers' long-term hybrid remote working plans that don't work with your plans? Is it your willingness to engage more diverse suppliers? Or is it the location concentration risk? So please, lovely, if you can, submit some responses to it. We've got a good number of attendees on today's webinar. It'd be great to get a sense in terms of the challenges that you're seeing. So we normally keep these polls open for less than a minute, so not sitting here for too long. But actually, it's really interesting to see there's been a pretty good mix. And actually, we'll go on to the data we've actually seen from our own research, which seems to be aligning fairly well to the outcomes that we're getting as well. So maybe if we give it 10 seconds before we close it, we've had a good response actually. So over 70% of people have participated, so that's great. So appreciate everyone taking part. So maybe if we give it 5, 4, I won't count down. Everyone's clever enough to count on this call, I think. So thank you very much. So what we're seeing actually is that the number one reason that people are looking at changing is a shortage of talent and skills. So that really aligns to, I think, what we've seen in our data that we'll come on to. The second area was around rising cost of labor and materials. So 47% of the people who responded have said that's one of the reasons that's triggered a re-evaluation as well. We're looking then at areas such as willingness to engage more diverse suppliers at 30% and concentration risk at 28%. And very understandably, the Russia-Ukraine crisis is only at 9% because that's very geo-specific about where you're having your delivery services from. So if we move on to the next slides, I appreciate everyone taking the time to do that. If we move on to the next slide, what you can see is actually the responses that we got from our own research would sort of align pretty well to that. But when we look at the fact that, okay, what are the issues that people are seeing that's triggered that re-evaluation, very much aligns to what you've seen there. So the number one issue is around the shortage of talent and skills. And at Everest Group, if you've attended any of our other webinars, you know that we actually talk a lot about the issue with talent and skills across the globe. And there are some geos where it's better or worse than others, but typically companies in the services and outsourcing space are running into issues around talent and skills. Rising labor and materials cost, I think, again, we've talked a lot about that, and people are seeing that with inflation growing significantly across most of the world, materials increasing, supply chain issues, that has caused people to look at it. And then the third factor is around that concentration risk of locations. And I think what we've saw as a result of the pandemic is that people are very focused much more now on risk. So I think we've always talked about it. I'd been in procurement for 17, 18 years for a large American company before moving into consulting and now as an analyst. And we always talked about risk, but it was always one of the factors. And I think that risk is now becoming one of the key factors that definitely people in sourcing and procurement are focusing on, as well as obviously cost, which is also top of the priority list. So interesting to see that those of you on the webinar really do align pretty well to what we've seen from an industry perspective. So as you start thinking about this, then you start to realize, okay, you do need to then reevaluate where you are in terms of your portfolio. So that leads you into thinking, how do you do that? And Bhanusha, I think you're going to give us some sort of sense in terms of how we see organizations are thinking about their portfolio strategies.
Yeah. And so thanks, David. This is one of the things that organizations have been doing for a long time, right? They look at their entire supply base and then they decide whether they should consolidate it, whether they should add new suppliers to it, or whether they should be adding distributing work across the suppliers that they already have. So these are essentially the three strategies that we have seen organizations take when it comes to their supplier portfolio. And they're very aligned to the objectives they want to achieve, right? So some of the factors that David detailed in the previous slide, for example, improving access to talent, that's a major objective when it comes to changing strategies these days. Take an example of supplier consolidation. When it comes to supplier consolidation, you're looking at various things, right? The first objective you'll think about is cost. So maybe consolidation will actually reduce the cost that you're incurring or the spend that you're incurring as a part of your supplier portfolio. In fact, we've seen as a part of research that it leads to about 28% savings in a lot of enterprises across the board. So that is something that can be a result of consolidation. Whereas if you look from the risk angle, you're also probably reducing the risk that you're incurring in your supply base because you have less number of suppliers if you've consolidated them. So less risks to measure, less risk, maybe risk to incur, but maybe there is a concentration risk that you incur in that case. Supposing your major suppliers that you've consolidated down to are in a particular geography. So you're actually increasing risk on the geopolitical front if there is some location concentration issue there, but you've reduced risk on an overall perspective. And of course, you can look at other aspects as well, right? Like productivity. So there's a certain ease of supplier governance that comes into play when you've consolidated your portfolio. So all of these things kind of are various building blocks to what it would lead to a final decision of consolidation. And one of the things that, over the years, we've heard a lot of organizations talk a lot about consolidation, right? Many clients come to us and they say that we had an application services portfolio of say 100 suppliers and we consolidated it down to only 5 IT suppliers. So, but one trend that we've seen change in the past is through addition of more suppliers as well, which gets to the last part of this thread, right? Which is the portfolio diversification part. So organizations are thinking more and more about once you've consolidated your portfolio, now you want to think about what are the skill sets that you want to add into it, which your top 3 or 4 suppliers are not fulfilling. So this is about adding specialist suppliers in the mix. We have an in-house, specialist BFSI IT specialist expert here, Kriti, who will talk about this later. But this is increasingly becoming an objective. And again, in this, maybe your costs will increase because you're technically adding more suppliers to the mix. But maybe you're reducing your risk at an overall level because you're not thinking about sole sourcing anymore. And of course, you're increasing productivity because you're adding new capabilities to the mix. So keeping all of these considerations in mind, I want to move, to the framework that we want to talk about in this slide, in this, webinar today, which is the Rubik's Cube sort of framework for portfolio design. Now, this is really, when you think about solving a Rubik's Cube and when you think about solving a supplier portfolio design, creating a supplier portfolio, it is really a similar sort of mindset, right? Because we've seen a lot of organizations come to us and they want to just solve one objective that, we want to maybe consolidate our supplier portfolio because we have increased costs, or we want to reduce our location concentration risk because we have too much work offshore. So why don't you, tell us how to move more work from offshore to nearshore or onshore locations? But what we've seen actually happening in principle is that, you look at only one part of the cube. So you've solved one part of the cube, but you realize that once you solve, for instance, say that location delivery mix, you see the other part of it and all the other things are not working out so well. So what about things like your outsourcing posture? Have you outsourced too much by looking, reassessing your location risk, or have you kind of messed up your language mix within your supplier portfolio? Do you have the right type of contingency plans in place anymore, or is it all concentrated to one type of suppliers only? So the same analogy again works here. If you know the trick to working with multiple kind of aspects together and balancing all of these things, that is the only way you can move from an unbalanced portfolio mix to a balanced portfolio mix. So all of the questions that you have within your mind need to be first laid down into a very strategic framework as to what are the things that are important for you. Is it just location mix? Is it also outsourcing posture? Is it the number of diverse suppliers in your portfolio? Or is it your language considerations? When you put all of these things together, then you can actually go about solving the cube properly and solving this puzzle in the most optimum way possible. So all the factors that go into it, I'll quickly get into that in the next slide. There are many, many things that come into it, but we've tried to sort of, divide it into two aspects. So the first thing we need to do is think about our own organization. What are the sort of, we call these the enterprise thresholds. What are your thresholds as a supplier portfolio manager, as a sourcing professional, when it comes to, say, strategic supplier concentration? How much spend are you comfortable with having with your top strategic supplier? Is it 50%? Is it 70%? Or how much is it? And how are your incumbent suppliers performing? Is there a certain performance level that you're expecting from your suppliers, or do you want to move work across your suppliers because you're not getting optimum supplier performance from them? So when you look at the top part of this slide, you'll see all the factors that an internal organization can think about while deciding their portfolio, right? One of them is, of course, outsourcing willingness. Are you willing to outsource more to external service providers? Do you want to keep work in-house? Do you want to move it to your GBSs? Or what do you want to do? So all of these, of course, when you think about each and every factor, you feel that, okay, there are different types of frameworks that will go into deciding each of these considerations, and they warrant a lot of discussions, so to say, in all of these places. Similarly, when you look at something like, a type of commercial model, is it that your service providers have a lot of fixed fee contracts only? Do you want to increase the percentage of outcome or output-based constructs within your service provider mix? If that is the case, maybe you should think about engaging maybe more suppliers in that mix, or maybe even with your current incumbent suppliers, you can think about increasing those type of constructs. You'll only be able to do so when you have that visibility on that entire portfolio in terms of internal organizational considerations. So that is one part of it. And the second part is, of course, the market view, right? So if you look at your supplier portfolio, is it that it's a very risk-prone portfolio? Do you have all of your service delivery presence in one location? Do you feel that you are incurring more of geopolitical risks? Do you have more chances of incurring some sort of macroeconomic risks? Or what are providers? This is a conversation, in fact, which has been coming up a lot. This is around providers' return to office or hybrid work plans. So if that is the case, then how comfortable are you with having your service providers changing their contracts with the RTO type of models? Or is there something that you need to change as an organization within your supplier portfolio to be able to manage that? So all of these factors considered together will actually help you decide on your portfolio.
Banushi, I know we haven't prepared this, so apologies, but I don't like to sit on these things and not ask a question if it occurs to me, and I think the audience might be interested. But how do we see the portfolio strategies evolve since before the pandemic? Because my hypothesis is I think there was a lot of focus before the pandemic around consolidation. I mean, I think during the pandemic, we saw people looking to diversify a bit more because of the risk factors. What's your view in terms of that? Are we seeing a move from consolidation back to diversification and now back to consolidation, or what's your view?
Yeah, No, I think that's a great point, David. I remember that we were talking about this before the pandemic or during the pandemic, and it was that 3/4 of the organization that we had surveyed were consolidating. And then we moved to, pre last year, where you and I remember we did another webinar and we did a poll in it, as well as collected more data. And we saw that now it was more about adding suppliers as well as adding locations to the mix. So the more argument came there, right? Everybody wanted to get more specialists, go to more emerging locations, and go into that space. But now at this stage, I feel that it's become more about balancing your portfolio. So nobody is thinking just about, adding suppliers or consolidating. It's just about looking at where you are in the stage. So if you're still at that 100 suppliers in your app services portfolio, you want to get down to 3. But if you're at 3, maybe you want to think about adding more specialists or locations to the mix.
Yeah, so really this is where the Rubik's Cube analogy comes really vital, because actually it's more complex than just saying consolidation or costs or add more or cost. Is actually thinking about all those 3 different parameters at the same time. So looking at it as an entirety versus consolidation is our strategy. Thank you. Yeah, no, I hope you don't mind, but I think it's good just sometimes to, if things come up to me, they're probably coming up to some of the audience. I thought I would get that covered. So great, please carry on with discussion on the control ratios.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think the control ratios is a vital way to kind of manage this whole balancing of this Rubik's Cube, right? So when you're thinking about so many factors together, we must have talked about at least, 15 factors in the previous slide. But we do want to first understand what is important for us as an organization, what is actually affecting the supplier portfolio. And then once we have done that, we need to define certain ratios that will help us set limits to the factors that are there. As an example, we worked with this, leading transportation and logistics company. And one of their objectives was just, in decreasing their location risks. So they were moving a lot of work from offshore to nearshore. And they had decided that they will not have more than 70% of work in offshore locations. So a lot of work was moving from India to Mexico. Not to say that, you should move work from India to Mexico. But the point here is that you need to decide whether this is some sort of risk threshold that you want to create within your firm. And it can be across a lot of things, right? I know that David has worked, for instance, with a lot of CXM organizations, and language is a very important consideration there. So some firms are just coming up with ratios saying that at least 50% of resources in contact centers should have Spanish language skills across delivery locations. So one of the factors can also be that. And then, of course, another threshold that you can set can be around the whole, GBS organization perspective, that how much work do you want to insource versus how much work do you want to outsource? So one ratio can be no more than 30% of spend should be managed by a GBS organization. One of the things that you'll see across all of these ratios is how they're very, very specific. So we've tried to keep it as, measurable as possible, right? So when you're talking about, say, multilingual coverage, you want to look at the number of resources that are there and then take 50% of resources. Similarly, with location mix, we're thinking about spend and then saying 50% of spend should be managed offshore or onshore. It can be done in different ways, but it's very important to make it measurable so that you're actually able to implement it properly. All right, so that was from an internal point of view, right? You've looked at your organization, had those conversations across the board, and now you're on the second part of it, which is looking at the market, right? We do a lot of consulting, advisory related projects at Everest Group as well. And it's always, around first getting the organizational perspective. You do an entire internal assessment, that you look at the market, and then you're able to marry both of these perspectives and figure out a forward-looking strategy which will be best for you. So benchmarking is the second part of this whole game, right? And how that can be done is, of course, through a peer comparison. So how are your peers evaluating their own supplier portfolio? You can look at your industry segment. You can get benchmarks from the market related to it. Maybe it's something like, what is the share of spend that is with the largest supplier? So you can look at, what are the minimum spend that is there in the market, maximum, and compare your spend to those thresholds and see where you lie, so that you can ultimately decide whether you're too high with your largest supplier or whether you're too low. So this is something that is very, crucial to help you set those ratios in place. So it can be hard to think about, okay, how much do we actually feel comfortable with giving to your top supplier? But once you know what the market is doing, it's actually much more easier for you to implement the same.
And Banushi, just before we move on, I think one of the things, a question that we've had in the chat, and I think it's a good time to answer it now, actually, versus trying to leave it to the end, which is, do we actually see that the work from home environment has changed the part of the matrix? So does location matter anymore? I mean, I can offer my view, which is I think it still does. So even if people are working from home, you have to factor the location into your localization and concentration risk. Because actually, even though they're working from home, there may still be issues in the economic environment, in the broader security situation. So I think even if people are working from home and not actually having to be in a center or in an office, then you still have to factor that in, even if they're working from home. And I think that we also know that a lot of people can't work from home because of the type of work they're doing. So I still think location is important as part of the strategy, even though people are working from home. But do you agree with that, or feel free to disagree?
Oh, definitely. I just feel that the whole, return to work from home game has changed some of the locations that we were considering in the past too. So now, for instance, even somebody like an Accenture will be opening offices in tier 2 or satellite cities, which was not such a common scenario earlier, right? So we're serving more locations across the board. That openness has come into play, but it's not that it's caused a major change, in terms of the overall perspective.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Great. So the last thing on this section, and this was around the whole designing the portfolio strategy framework, right? So we looked at all the internal considerations. We've looked at the market benchmarking. The last thing we need to do is marry these two and then figure out what are the forward-looking strategies that you need to design for your portfolio. And if you see this slide, this has a lot of examples from what we have seen organizations do. And I will go through some of them and try to give you some examples from that. But do note that this is not something that we're trying to prescribe, right? Just examples. It may differ a lot for your organization, depending on your industry and depending on the benchmarking you've done. So the first one, for instance, is how much spend do you want to consolidate with your top tier service providers? So one of the firms we worked with decided that they're consolidating their 90% spend with no more than 5 service providers. This was a control ratio, in fact, that they had set in place, right, after they had done their analysis. The second one is actually very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit more around that. This is actually called the champion challenger strategy. So what firms are doing is that they have a champion in a particular area, say, IT, AMS. What they would do is they would introduce a challenger in that space with not much difference of spend between the two, say, less than 20% spend difference between the champion and the challenger. And that kind of strategy would actually introduce some sort of competitive rivalry between the two at all times, so that the firm actually ends up getting the best benefits out of the deal. So they would get the best services, they would get the best pricing, just because the top champion supplier doesn't feel like there is no other option with the firm in that case. So that is one strategy that we've seen very commonly being used within supplier portfolios. And sometimes, this type of thing is also done to mitigate risk, because supposing your top tier service provider is not able to serve your critical process area for some time due to any reason, right? Then you always have that second option, so that second supplier or the challenger supplier can serve that area well too. So that is a very interesting strategy. And of course, we have many other strategies that we have given examples of. One of the things being, maybe, for instance, ensuring alignment with portfolio control ratios. We've talked a lot about this. Clearly articulating the roles for your supplier to avoid any redundancy or overlapping. Though having said, avoid redundancy, sometimes it's always good to build redundancy so that you mitigate that risk in case any sort of service area fails. So with that, I think I'll put an end to this section, and we're going to jump a little bit on the next section, which is around giving you a market view of what organizations are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Benicia. And just one thing I would talk about on, if we could just go back one slide, just so we're not going onto the poll too quickly. One of the things I would say about champion challenger is it is important to think about, if you're going to set a champion challenger model, and I've used that quite a lot in my previous career, which is what's the thresholds for actually then changing it around so the champion becomes the challenger and the challenger becomes the champion. So I think you have to be fair when you use a champion challenger model, and there needs to be a route to the top. And actually it's unfair on the challenger if they're always just seen as the challenger and it's being used to leverage the champion. So I think you do also have to think about that, and we talk a bit at the end of this session around governance as well, in terms of the importance of governance in this. And I think that's really important to call out there, which is you can't make someone a challenger forever if there's no route to be the champion. That's just frustrating. So yeah, if we can move on then. So we're now going to look at the market perspectives. And so again, wanted just to pose a question to the audience, just to get a sense in terms of what are your objectives for your supplier portfolio. And so if you could take a look at these questions and give us your view in terms of, okay, what are the objectives? You can pick more than one, but what's the objectives for your supplier portfolio? So the poll is open. So if you can start responding, that would be great. So are you looking to alter the outsourcing mix? So I've have more or less outsourcing. Is it your location mix that you're looking to change? Is it adding specialist providers? Is it optimize your cost? Is it to ensure diverse supplier mix, multilingual coverage in your supply base if that's necessary, or create contingency plans for key suppliers? So it'd be good to get your view in terms of what are the key things that you're seeing. We'll just keep open. I think there's a good mix of people responding. So we're nearly up to 50% of people responding. So if you could just give us your views. This really also helps us to really be able to educate the market and talk about what we're seeing in the market in terms of the trends and the key preferences that people are looking at. So key open for maybe 10 more seconds, and then we can we'll look to close the poll. No surprise, I think that optimizing cost is currently one of the leaders. I don't want to sound like I'm commentating on a horse race here, but optimizing cost is definitely out front, quite closely followed by contingency plans actually for your key suppliers. So I think the poll has just been closed. So what we can see actually is that, so if we look at the key driver in terms of the objectives for people's portfolios, optimizing cost is 65% of the respondents have said that is a key priority. Contingency plans for key suppliers, actually, that's second highest at 46%, which is really interesting, because I think that when many years, probably nearly 20 years ago when I started working in procurement, actually the whole concept of key suppliers was starting sort of fairly new. So now we're getting to a point of building contingency plans is great. The next two are both at 41%. So alter the outsourcing mix. So either more or less outsourcing, and alter the location mix and more work offshore or nearshore. And it'll be interesting on that alter the outsourcing mix to more or less outsourcing, whether that's to do more, to do less outsourcing. And maybe if people want to give a view in the chat on that, that'll be fine. But one of the things that we're seeing is that in some areas, like I'm heavily involved in customer experience management, we're actually seeing an increase in outsourcing. But we know in other areas there may be less outsourcing. So interesting, because we know we've got a wide audience here. So thank you for that. As we move on to the next slide, what we want to just sort of start to move into is some of the examples of what we're seeing in the market and what people are doing. And so one of the things that the initiatives we're seeing people undertake with their supplier portfolios are things such as, so how are they addressing their talent attrition issues? Because we touched on it earlier, but everyone is facing talent attrition issues. And one of the key initiatives that we're seeing people take is add emerging locations. And we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. But starting to think about where are those locations where you can get the talent you need at the numbers that you need them as well. The second one is around balance assuring mix in the supplier headcount. So whether that's scaling back on outsourcing or increasing the outsourcing, but doing it in a deliberate way where you are really controlling the amount of headcount you have within your suppliers, but also balancing that with the teams that you have internally. Addressing the upcoming skill needs, so actually thinking about what skills are we not only going to need today and tomorrow, but in 6-12 months time down the line, what are we going to need? So whether that's looking at bringing in specialist providers, whether they're tech centric, or whether it's around niche IT skills, because you know you're going to have a dependency on that, but really trying to address the upcoming skill, not just the skill you've got now. And that's where I think sourcing and procurement need to work really closely with the business to understand, well, where are we going as an organization, so you can get ahead of that demand. And then the last one is ensure adequate risk mitigation. And that's around adequate contingency planning. So the fact that critical processes are not going to be disrupted during service delivery challenges. And I think that's really important because, again, as I was saying before, there's been a lot of focus in terms of business continuity planning, definitely through the pandemic. Before, it was always there, but I think it's really become to the front right now because people know that you need to have those robust business continuity plans. So making sure that's in your supplier portfolio is going to be critical as well. So we're moving on now, and I think Kriti, you're going to take us through some of the activities that firms are doing in terms of specialists in their supplier pool.
Yes, sure, David. So I think what is quite interesting is at the start of the webinar, when we asked you what triggered you to relook at your portfolios, location diversification and meeting this talent shortage was the reason, and looking at the objectives now as you look to rebalance your portfolio, managing costs and planning for contingencies is coming out at the top, which is quite interesting, because if you look at it, planning for contingencies is all about managing risks, planning for risk management in advance. How do you look at de-risking your portfolio? So what we did, I think, some time back is we reached out to a lot of enterprises to gauge their thinking and understanding. How are they relooking at their portfolio? What are those triggers that are making them reevaluate some of their sourcing decisions? And while talent, increasing offshoring, looking at more partners was on the list, I think the top one, which is about increasing the use of specialists in their portfolio, was more than half of them wholeheartedly agreed to it, that this is something they are seeing increasingly and they would want to explore this further. And specialists, what they bring to the table is not just a talent expertise in a niche area or a domain expertise. It is also access to some of these new locations, access to some of these specialist skills. It could be a skill in the area of a system integration capability. It could be some proprietary IP that they're developing. They may have some unique engagement models, some unique talent skills that can enhance that overall portfolio and help expand the capabilities of your overall supplier base. So this is something I think that really came up in our interactions as well, that specialists and leveraging them more in the portfolio is something that is coming up every now and then. In a lot of our conversations, I think we increasingly get this question, hey, who are some of these specialists? Are there some of these categories? Are there some of these areas? Are they specializing in some locations? I think all of these are relevant questions. We'll touch upon some of these aspects as we move on. So needless to say, while specialists bring their own set of differentiators to the table, generalists also have their own unique sweet spot. So if you look at the four-pronged framework of around technology, talent, domain, and costs, while generalists definitely bring in that depth of mature technology offerings, specialists bring in a very advanced flavor of tracking these emerging technologies at scale. They have the right talent. They are very modernized in their approach as they track some of these emerging and niche technology themes. From a talent availability perspective, while generalists have these vast talent pools, scalable talent pools, I think that attrition is what that has been at the moment. The talent availability is a big challenge, which is making the specialist group coming up to the forefront quite more. The specialist segment is what they bring, even though the scalability remains limited. They have a very niche pool of talent available in specific set of locations and specific domains, which makes them very, very unique in their offerings in the market. From a domain understanding perspective, while generalists have broader domain capabilities, they operate across the breadth and depth of it. Specialists will go deeper into one or two particular areas and specialize in that, and they're very well known in the market for what they do and what they bring to the table. And lastly, from a cost perspective, while I think the generalists are the one who have mastered this area quite well, they know how to operate at scale, they can engage in multiple and innovative pricing constructs. I think this is an area where specialists, even though the flexibility is quite higher, in terms of bringing in those different models. But that capacity to engage, I think this is something we see is still in a very evolving phase. But both of them bring their own sweet spots to the table. They have their own areas of differentiators that they both play well to. But more on the talent and I think the domain side, specialists do have an edge, and they're increasingly being considered as organizations are relooking at their portfolio. So what also happens in a lot of this is as discussion around specialists comes, we are seeing this getting more nuanced. So it is no longer about, hey, can we have one or two specialist suppliers towards the tail end of our portfolio? No, it is all about, hey, as the broader geopolitical scenario changes, as the technology market changes, as the talent market is changing, organizations that are struggling or rather thinking about bringing in digital transformation, they are looking for including these specialist suppliers who can be incorporated in their overall technology stack, who can be incorporated with maybe a functional skill that they bring to the table, or it could be a very niche area from a domain or a geography perspective in which they operate. So from a technology stack perspective, it could be some of these specialists who specialize in AWS, Azure, GCP implementations, some of the other specialists who bring a very much of an agile DevOps implementation skills to the table, digital workplace methodologies that they can bring to scale. And from a geography or a domain perspective, they are these domain SMEs who can bridge the gap between the technology and the business requirements. So it is no longer about having one or two specialist suppliers in your portfolio, but rather a very proper methodology is being followed in what is the motive to engage with these specialists. Are you looking at some of these specific areas to engage them with? And I think what has also happened in a very IT services construct is working with a generalist who brings in that talent at scale, that domain across that entire breadth. There are increasing questions around, can we go deeper into a particular domain area? Can I go into a niche skill area? So a lot of consolidation and rationalization questions are coming up. Hey, can we de-risk? Can we balance the risk now? Can we have more of a balanced portfolio? Can we look at some of these specialist providers who can answer some of these questions that we have? And this is from, I think, what Bhanushi was referring to earlier, the Rubik's Cube, right? So from a capability perspective, this answers it. But what we have on the next slide is also, I think, from a location perspective, and David also touched upon this earlier, right? So location does still matter, even though we're moving a lot from in-office to hybrid and the return to office. A lot of these different models are coming in. But what is also happening is that the first step in a lot of the supplier portfolio redesign is also about rationalizing your locations. I think getting that right in place, getting that right number of locations that you want to have coverage on, and tying back to the control ratios also that Bhanushi mentioned earlier, right? So locations in which you are present also forms a key part of where you are present. It will define your supplier selection strategy as well. So focusing on locations that are new, I think, can we remain at the previous slide, please, for a minute? So focusing on a lot of these newer locations, I think it is not a short-term trend for sure. So countries, we saw during the times of pandemic, certain countries struggled with a hybrid working model, with a remote working model, and that impacted enterprises like you a lot because that location strategy was not very well defined. So is there some bit of a localization that needs to happen? So and what we are also seeing, I think, in a lot of countries, especially in the Middle East and Africa, we are seeing many large tech providers, some of these hyperscalers partnering with the enterprises in these local geographies to bring these solutions, the data analytics solution in one case, to scale. I think this was in Ghana. Similarly, in Nigeria, we had a large tech provider partnering with a local player to bring in some of these solutions at scale in the local region. So we are seeing emerging locations coming up to meet some of these talent demands as well.
And Kriti, before we move on, I guess it's also worth pointing out that these locations aren't necessarily fit for every single type of workload that you're looking for. So if it's IT services, might not fit a customer experience management or a finance and accounting outsourcing and vice versa. So it's also important about looking at the location and talent you're looking for based on the workload you're looking at that location for. And it's not just Poland, for example, is not going to fit everything, or Colombia is not going to fit everything. It's about the type of work you want to do there as well.
Definitely.
Just actually got a question while we're on location. So if we can just go back to the location side, we've got a question on locations, which is someone has raised the question about, we hear a lot about the Philippines, but we're not showing it on here. My view would be, yeah, the Philippines is a source destination for a lot of BPS work. May not necessarily be so much for IT services work, and these are just example locations. So just address that question as well. Another question, just to go back before we move on, Kriti, to your point earlier around generalists and specialists. We had a question about, can a large generalist like an Accenture also be a specialist? Be interested to get your view on that before we move on.
Sure, David. So I think I can add to it. And thanks for this question. What we're also seeing in this space is, while large generalists, or rather generalists, are seeing that threat coming in from the specialists in the portfolio, and they're trying to emulate that. They're trying to bring in and showcase, hey, we also have a specific skill set. They're trying to do that by ramping up separate teams, or setting up different business units, setting up COEs, saying, hey, this is what it operates in. But I think what we are seeing from a broader sentiment in the market is, while some of these initiatives happen, it is largely the specialist suppliers in terms of their size and scale, which gives them that edge. So while large generalists will try to emulate it, it will still be with the specialist suppliers in the true sense of our definition, who will have that edge and who will be able to get that mind share. Because with the larger, I think generalists, the last piece on this is, areas around contracting, areas around managing that vendor relationship, it is still at the end of the day with a generalist, with a large provider. So it is difficult to get in those constructs which you will get in with a specialist provider. So Panushi, David, if you have anything to add to it.
No, I think I'm good. Tanushi, I think we're going to talk a bit about now diverse suppliers in the portfolio.
Yeah. Yes, thanks. So I think one of the things it's good to see in this set of audience is that a lot of you commented on, increasing the number of diverse suppliers within your supplier portfolio. And that's always good validation to get for us, right? Because increasingly we are getting a lot of questions from our clients as well as members to our program as well on this aspect, that who are the suppliers that are diverse and are also within the outsourced services landscape. So we have sort of started building some research on that. But one trend that we really want to talk about today is the increasing consideration of diverse suppliers in large supplier portfolios. And this is a part of the larger ESG objectives. And I don't want to say that, this is something that has just started, right? Diversity has been a common topic for the past many years, especially in the US. But increasingly within the entire supplier portfolio, the metric that you have for supplier diversity is becoming increasingly important. So many firms are trying to build plans or programs for having an entire diverse supplier portfolio in their space. And when I talk about supplier diversity here, we're typically talking about ownership diversity, right? So who are the suppliers that have the sort of certifications, who are certified by the 16 standards of diversity that are specified by the US government? That can be something like, the women-owned business, Women Business Enterprise National Council, which is the WBENC, or minority-owned business, which is certified by a very large body based in the US again, NMSDC. So all of these suppliers which have applied for those certifications, they have these certain protocols in place even within the firm to have managed this, are there in the outsourced services landscape as well. And some of them are pretty large, and some of them are of course very small and niche suppliers that you all may not have heard of at all. And probably they're not serving the sort of digital transformation efforts that you are looking for, but they are able to serve your basic ITS needs or your basic CXM needs too. So some examples, I've tried to give some examples of this in the bottom of the slide, and you would look here to see that these are pretty small, niche, diverse suppliers. But if you want to think about even larger suppliers, I want to give two more examples, which is around GEP. It's a very large procurement outsourcing player. And similarly, there's GlowTouch as well. Again, not too large as a whole, but then they also have the supplier diversity certification, and they serve a lot of areas within CXM. So apart from that, apart from the larger suppliers, we also have suppliers such as Abitor, they're a women-owned business. They would be certified by WPENC, and they're serving the ITS landscape. Similarly, Alum is serving procurement. Artec is serving a contingent workforce solutions. They have NMSDC as well as WBENC. So these are just certain examples over here which I wanted to point out. But it is increasingly being a bigger factor of consideration, along with something like environmental considerations as well. So IR service providers following certain type of environment related practices within their organization, which can be something like maybe doing things more against deforestation efforts, or having those certifications with ISO or not. So these things are becoming increasingly important as we think about the larger ESG agenda. And moving on to our last point, we started from a lot of enterprise trends. We're adding specialists, adding locations, adding diverse suppliers, doing all of these things, right? But when you look at the market as a whole, we do know that there's a lot of ongoing service price inflation. Linking back to your point that your major objective is to optimize costs, with the inflation that is going on right now within the services landscape, how do you manage that whole optimization of cost angle? Especially when you look at inflation across services areas, we try to give you a view just across onshore geographies. You'll see that next gen skills are increasingly getting inflated when you compare them to the 2017 level. So the easiest way to read this graph is when you think about 100 as the base price, now a next gen IT infrastructure skill would be standing at 122%, right? Similarly, if you look at the commoditized skill, the inflation is a bit lower. So it's 113%, and your traditional skills are, of course, a bit lower as well. But then when you think about the overall landscape, there has been a lot of inflation, and not just the usual level of inflation, which is what you would have seen till, say, 2020. The graph has actually moved up a very steep curve since 2020. And even the projection that we have for this particular half year, H2 2022, it seems to be moving up that steep curve as well. So we don't expect inflation to die down anytime soon. And we expect this services cost inflation to go higher up and higher up. So what do enterprises do when service providers are coming back to them and asking them for rate increases within their contracts? It's fine in the normal scenario, right? But what if you have a renewal coming up as well? Service providers are bound to come back to you, especially if they're in the next gen IT skill landscape, to ask you for that rate increase, to ask you for contracting changes in that space. So it is increasingly becoming important to define your supplier's value in their entire portfolio. So is that supplier even providing an advantage over their immediate competitors? Look at the whole market view. It's not always the case that the supplier is asking for an increase and that's not warranted. That there may be a case that the market is actually above in that sense, and they are asking for a pretty reasonable increase depending on their skill sets. So with all of these things in consideration and your entire portfolio, we need to think about, what are the cost savings you can get, but while creating that access to skills as well as access to talent, because that is also an increasingly important aspect when it comes to today's scenario.
Thanks, Panushi. And I think that moves us nicely on to, there's only a couple of slides left and then we'll get on to the Q&A. But this is a complimentary offer that we'd like to make to the enterprise buyers within the audience. So this isn't open to service providers, but is open to enterprise buyers. And there'll be a link in the chat where you can specify your interest. But we're very happy to give you a complimentary price check. And what we're looking at here is that 3 roles from a set of functions that you can see on the screen across 3 countries from a set of 6 countries, again, that you can see on the screen. So we have a very vast database of over 250 roles in 32 countries, but we're willing to have a discussion, to give you a complimentary price check to see how your roles compare. Because one of the things that I know from having been in the role of a procurement or senior procurement director was actually that you think your rates may be fairly attractive or fairly competitive, but actually it's because you don't know what your competitors are out in the market are paying. So even though you may negotiate hard and get a 5-10% rate decrease, which would have been in those days, not necessarily now, you might have already been paying 10% more. So you may be not actually gaining much from your negotiation. So we always advocate really getting a good understanding of how your pricing compares in the market, because that gives you a great starting point. So you can be prepared if you know you're paying less than market rate, or actually you can be looking at savings if you're paying well above the market rate. So please sort of make use of this complimentary price check that we're offering if you're in an enterprise. We'd love to continue the conversation with you on that. And so just moving into wrapping up, one of the things that we've talked about a lot is this sort of the concept of the Rubik's Cube, which I did have to check when we started this that everyone understood what a Rubik's Cube is, but I'm glad to know that it's a fairly global concept. So that's great. But some of the stuff that we've seen, so the key success factors that we're seeing companies adopt for their portfolio strategies is really ensure your portfolio changes meet organizational objectives. So really think about what you're trying to do as an organization. How does that align to your ESG objectives? So Banushi touched on there around the supplier diversity. So what are your ESG objectives and how's your supplier portfolio going to help you meet that? But also how's it going to drive your operational efficiencies, balance that risk between your locations and your suppliers? And how does it really drive the efficiencies that you're looking to do, but taking in consideration things such as geopolitical risks, but also where your business wants to go in the future? So definitely making sure that your portfolio changes meet your organizational objectives is number one priority there. Second one is around creating access to talent and skills for that diversified supply base. So we talk a lot about the fact that there is a shortage of talent out there and it is getting harder to find the talent you need and you're going to have to pay more for it. So really looking for access to new talent. So we've talked about emerging geographies, and it will be different, as I was saying, there will be different geographies depending on what skills that you're looking for. But think about it from an IT perspective, but from a business process outsourcing perspective as well. Think what are those alternative geographies that you could be considering? Looking at different types of provider types, because that will give you greater levels of flexibility. So whether they're sort of the large generalists, whether they're a specialist or niche, and what skills do they bring to you? But looking at it in the whole to say, what skills do we need? And then the other thing I talk a lot about, which is what skills do we need in the future, not just today, because then you can start preparing your supplier base, because onboarding and offboarding suppliers is not easy. It's expensive, it's stressful, it takes time. So if you're not already prepared for where you need to be in the future, it's not something you can just switch out overnight. It's not like buying a commodity. It's actually people and its services and its skills. So you need to be thinking about where you need to be in the future. And then the last one, which isn't very sexy or exciting, but actually I think is really important and underpins all of this, is around setting up effective governance. So what are those control ratios that we touched on? How do you measure if you've got a champion challenger model? When does that challenger become a champion? How do you get spend visibility? So who are you spending your money with? Where are they? Because if you set control ratios, you really need to be able to make sure you have visibility of those, because there's no point setting them if you're just going to ignore them and only look at them once or twice in a life of a contract. That's not going to drive your business forward. And then also ensure engage regularly to discuss the sort of the issues that you're seeing with your suppliers and the buying. So for me, that's all about engaging and having really strong supplier relationship management. So engaging with the suppliers at a strategic level, exposing them to your strategy so they can be preparing their strategies to align to your strategy as well, and really engaging with them when things are going well as badly, because often we engage with suppliers when things are going badly, but not necessarily engaging when things are going well, but thinking about where we're going to go in the future. So hopefully that's sort of giving the audience here some sense in terms of what we see from an Everest Group perspective around your service provider portfolios and what you could be doing. In the last couple of minutes, just want to take a couple of questions we had come in from the audience. And one of them actually is really relevant to what we've just been talking about, which is around when diversifying your portfolio or adding specialist suppliers, what are your thoughts on managing the additional cost and effort of management and governance of a large supply base? So that's a perfect question, because we've talked about adding suppliers, we've talked about governance, but Kriti or Banushi, anything that you would want to share to answer that question?
I think that's a great question. And like David, you covered some of it in the last part of your summary slide, right? But I think the best practices we've seen is, again, coming back to the basics that we talked about in the beginning. So when you're thinking about adding new suppliers or new specialists to the mix, think about it from all angles. So you will need to assess their cost considerations. You will need to assess the new pricing level. So who needs to be involved at that stage? Who's going to be doing the reporting for that? And where is the dashboard that you're going to integrate that whole information in? Similarly, when you look from a risk angle, you would think about who would be making the mitigation plans for these new suppliers. Are you able to integrate that again into a common single source of truth? And around, of course, the whole efficiency angle, I do agree that some of the administrative burden really can increase, but that would also depend on how many suppliers you have consolidated to in the initial stage, right? If you're not sitting at a very large portfolio, maybe it will not be such a burden to add specialists.
Yeah. Anything to add to that, Kriti?
Yeah, I think I'll just add one piece to it. So given a lot of focus around bringing in specialist suppliers is also to unlock access to the talent, because in the talent crisis, what we really saw, it was not the lack of talent, but rather lack of deployable right talent at the right time that created an issue for organizations and enterprises. So having, I think, access to that talent can actually help you assess that business case and that opportunity cost of balancing, okay, having more of these suppliers versus not having them. So I think that the benefits that, like Bhanushi mentioned, think about the end state in mind and then start working towards it.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the last question, and I think we'd be perfect on time then and let people have 1 minute before their next call, is a question was asked around are more and more organizations looking at opening GBSE, so in-house captive centers, and increasing their spend in GBSEs at the cost of reducing offshoring. I'm not sure if you guys have a view. I mean, I think from the different practice areas I cover, I think it sounds like a horrible analyst answer, but actually I think we see both. I think in certain areas we're seeing that companies are looking at bringing stuff back in-house and setting up GBSEs for certain tasks. But for other tasks, like, for example, customer experience management, where I spend a lot of my time, we're actually seeing an increase in outsourcing. So I think it depends on the function, the skill set, the type of organization that you're working with. But again, Kriti or Bhanushi, feel free to disagree with me if you have a different view.
I think I'll just add one piece to that, David. So, and this is coming specifically from a banking and financial services perspective, at least what we saw recently in the last few quarters is some of these large BFS enterprises based out of North America, specifically based out of the United States, and not even being these multinational banks, but limited to US. They were thinking of opening their own GBSs and bringing in more control in-house. And this was primarily, I think, driven by the after effects as we got back to normal post the pandemic. But I think with the emerging signs around the corner from a macro perspective, the desire to get more control in place, to have more control over the outcomes, more control over the scope, that led to a lot of these things coming in-house. And yes, a lot of it was driven by reducing offshoring. So we were seeing some signs of that. But like David said, it was driven by the kind of work that you want to take in-house. Bhanushi, do you want to add anything to it?
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, I think from my experience, what I've heard firms reach out to us for is for those type of modeling constructs that we can build for them. So what are the decision-making considerations that you should put in a make versus buy versus put in an in-source GBS model? So we're getting those questions a lot, and we're trying to help firms with those outsourcing, insourcing, shoring, nearshoring type of decisions as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Bhanushi. So I'm conscious we're at the top of the hour, so thank you very much everyone for joining. Our contact details have been on the screen for quite a while. If you've got any questions, then please feel free to reach out. But thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, everyone.